The greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return.
This is possibly the most famous quote attributed to Baz Luhrmann's 2008 romantic musical Moulin Rouge, and is applicable as the message of most of his films. Raised in a small town in New South Wales, Australia, Luhrmann is recognised as an accomplished auteur and filmmaker and Australia's most commercially successful director, with 4 of his films in the top 10 highest grossing of all Australia. And although his filmography is comparatively small with only 5 director credits, he has a wide variety of projects not only in film but in television, theatre, music, even retail and architecture. And he is considered an auteur for his distinctive style and extensive involvement in writing, directing, design and music of his work, as well as the recurring themes present in each. Luhrmann was brought up as Mark Anthony Luhrmann in Herons Creek, New South Wales, and remains the small town's most famous output. His father owned the town's only cinema, and he was therefore exposed to cinema early. At a very young age, I was allowed to go to the cinema and watch adult films. He says of his childhood, "My father made sure I had lots of levels of education, from ballroom dancing to painting, commando training, theatre and magic. His ability in these fields is what prepared him for his future as a versatile director, and pushed him to establish his own theatre company only 2 years after graduating high school. At this point he'd already changed his name to Baz Mark Luhrmann. His only formal tertiary education is an acting degree, and he finally earned it after a 2-year course in 1985. In 1986, Luhrmann wrote and directed a play, Strictly Ballroom, for his theatre company, using his background in dance and opera as an inspiration. It was hugely successful, and Luhrmann was soon approached by recently founded film company M&A Productions to adapt the play to cinema. He agreed, and the resulting Strictly Ballroom 1992 was a critical success at the Cannes Film Festival and went on to win 8 AFI, now known as ACTRA Awards. The film followed Scott Hastings as he attempts to turn the Australian ballroom dancing scene on its head by dancing his own steps, which is seen as a huge controversy. He sacrifices his entire career to dance the way he wants to in the final competition with his new partner and girlfriend Fran. And this motif of sacrifice, particularly for love, was to be repeated many times in Luhrmann's career. Strictly Ballroom was the first film in the Red Curtain trilogy, a genre which Baz Luhrmann himself conceived, which followed 3 basic rules. The story needs to be set in a heightened creative world, it must be based on a recognizable story shape, and the audience must be aware that what they are watching isn't real. Luhrmann has said that all of his films in this trilogy revolve around an element of theatre. In Strictly Ballroom, the element of cinema is dance, as the plot revolves around the main character's love for pushing the boundaries and breaking the rules of ballroom dancing. The trilogy is later completed by Romeo and Juliet 1996 and Moulin Rouge in 2001, which each have their own element of cinema as a focus. Luhrmann's next film was Romeo and Juliet, which was the second in the Red Curtain trilogy, as it was based on Shakespeare's classic tragedy after which it was named, and the original script is largely unaltered in Baz Luhrmann's version of the film. The element of cinema that is the motif of Romeo and Juliet is that of language and poetry. It is also a significant development of Baz Luhrmann's iconic style, drawing on elements of Strictly Ballroom and toning them up considerably. A review by BBC film journalist Sandy Chaitram states, "The film is beautifully shot with vivid and bizarre sets. Luhrmann makes the Capulets ball a glitzy affair with every frame dripping in wealth. The music is loud and the pace is fast. The frenetic camera work drives the audience through the film as the ill-fated pair hurtles towards their doom." This review highlights many of the elements that denote Baz Luhrmann's iconic style: vivid colours, extravagant and sometimes excessive sets, pronounced soundtracks, and fast-paced filming with many quick cuts and sometimes disorienting framing. Romeo and Juliet is another example of sacrifice for love. Romeo and Juliet, the youngest of warring families, sacrifice everything to love one another, and the tragedy ends with their suicide in each other's arms. Further evidence of Baz Luhrmann's preoccupation with love and the lengths people will go to in order to preserve it. His next and final film in the Red Curtain trilogy was Moulin Rouge, released in 2001 and based on the Parisian cabaret Moulin Rouge. The film is based on the theatre element of song to complement the first two films that Luhrmann produced, and completes the trilogy. Sacrifice was once more used as a motif, with Ian McGregor often spouting profound sentiments such as, "The greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return," which is a message that can be applied to many of Luhrmann's films. Through Moulin Rouge was perhaps the most overt, with both main characters sacrificing wealth and almost their lives for love. Like his previous work, the film was polarizing, with some praising the costume and set design, of which it won 2 Oscars for, and others criticizing the excessive and shallow nature of the film. Renowned critic Roger Ebert said of the film, "The movie is all color and music, sound and motion, kinetic energy, broad strokes, operatic excess. The story is obvious, and then all the rest is song and dance, spectacular production numbers. It's like being trapped on an elevator with the circus." While critic Elvis Mitchell feels the film is just too excessive, Moulin Rouge will be accused of having no heart, but the truth is the opposite. The movie has so much heart that the poor overworked organ explodes in every scene. Baz Luhrmann didn't release another film for a while after Moulin Rouge. During this time, he had brought on one of his old productions to Broadway and won 3 Tony Awards, directed a commercial for perfume Chanel No. 5, titled No. 5 the Film, which had a $33 million budget for a 180-second short, became an ambassador for the Australian Theatre for Young People, and was asked by the Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to produce advertisements promoting Australia's tourism, which had happened to coincide with the release of Baz Luhrmann's next film, Australia, 2008. Australia was a considerable departure from Luhrmann's ordinary style of filmmaking, which had been developing and culminating thus far in Moulin Rouge, possibly to indicate the trilogy, and therefore that era had ended. Australia had none of the elaborate flashy sets, standout soundtracks, or fast-paced filming that Luhrmann had harnessed until that point to define his filmmaking style. Instead, Australia was relatively slow-paced, and a 2.5-hour-long epic that explored social and racial politics of Luhrmann's native Australia. Set in the early 1940s against the backdrop of World War II, with none of the modern elements that made his previous work stand out. Australia is almost unrecognisable as being Baz Luhrmann's own, with Roger Ebert commenting, "Coming from a director known for his punk rock William Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, and his visual pyrotechnics of Moulin Rouge, it is exuberantly old-fashioned, and I mean that as a compliment." It follows Lady Ashley as she joins a ragtag group to muster cattle from her outback property to Sydney before they're stolen by monopolistic villain King Carney. Once this is complete, the film abruptly shifts focus to World War II and explores Lady Ashley's relationship with half-Aboriginal boy Nulla, who is taken as part of the white Australian policy. In an event later termed The Stolen Generation, Baz's original themes of sacrifice aren't a central focus in this film either. While they are present, they're hardly the driving force in the narrative. Therefore, this film is the biggest departure from Baz Luhrmann's regular work. Though this didn't work to the favour of its critical reception, though it was still the second highest grossing Australian film in history. However, after Australia, Baz Luhrmann embarked on his next film project, and in 2013 The Great Gatsby was released, and was widely considered a return to form from the director. Based on novel The Great Gatsby 1925, it follows Nick Carraway, a penniless observer of his far wealthier cousin Daisy and her husband during the Roaring Twenties, and soon comes into the company of Jay Gatsby, who has loved Daisy for years and is determined to do anything to win her back. Ultimately, he sacrifices himself out of love for her and is murdered by a grieving widower, whose wife Daisy killed in an accident. This continues the motif present in Luhrmann's work of sacrificing everything for love, though in this case the love was somewhat unrequited. The Great Gatsby was his most extravagant, decadent, dizzying effort yet, as well as his most expensive, with a budget of $105 million, and contained all of the themes what had become staples of Luhrmann's style. A story of love so great that Gatsby would sacrifice anything for it. A story set in the past but with modern elements such as music by hip-hop artists such as Jay-Z and Kanye. Over-the-top carefully constructed scenes and sets. Over-the-top camera work and vivid colours, all told in a flashback from the point of view of a writer who has arrived penniless, as happens in previous movies of Luhrmann's, and learns a message about the ordeal, that love is fickle. Baz Luhrmann can be considered an auteur because of his distinct style. Vivid colours, extravagant, intricate sets, indispensable soundtracks, and fast-paced filming with unique methods of cutting and framing, which he only departs from in one film. And his continuing themes throughout all his films, the sacrifice of anything and everything for love. which often ends with the character, typically penniless, worse off than before. And while his stories are sometimes considered style over substance, they are undeniably intricately constructed to tell an entertaining and highly visually pleasing story to the audience, which reflects the dichotomy between his commercial success and audience popularity and his critical reception. Although his stories are largely visual, he has attempted to tackle socio-political issues in his work, especially in Australia, which explores Australia's controversial history of the stolen generations and its treatment of Indigenous peoples, as well as the impact of World War II. The Australian New Wave era of cinema, which lasted from the 1970s to the 1980s, was over before Luhrmann was old enough to contribute. However, he is a driving force in modern Australian filmmaking and is the most commercially successful Australian director today. Not only has he contributed to the film scene, but he is also an extensive playwright, which he visibly incorporates into much of his work, and has projects in many areas with acting and producing credits, a critical acclaimed TV show, campaign advertisements, and even organising the debut of major shopping complexes in his native Sydney, with Academy and Golden Globe Awards among many others to show for his efforts, although the fact he is a polarising figure is troubling to him, stating,
"Now, you know, I'm used to mixed reviews.
You get that all the time.
All the time.
Including
From Strictly
this
Ballroom,
film.
everything I've ever made. Every film I've ever made.
Why is that, do you think?
I think because we work outside the box. I think because I'm a particular language that I own, it's mine, and it offends some critics.
Baz Luhrmann's style of filmmaking has influenced a generation of filmmakers, regardless of whether they like him or not, for the effort he has put into all his films with heavy involvement in all aspects of his work, from writing, directing, design, music, and his wide variety and large amount of projects, spanning from film, television, opera, theatre, music, sound recording, industries, events, retail, architecture, and the way he has honed these skills by devoting himself to a number of crafts, beginning his own theatre company only 2 years after graduating with no tertiary education, and beginning in a small town in New South Wales, where Australia has very few directors comparatively that are able to break into the large global market. Furthermore, the effort he puts into his film scenes, with large choreographed groups and elaborate set design, is inspiring, and something that anyone can consider implementing into their own work. Despite his faults, such as an issue some people feel with the way he delivers messages, and the style over substance approach that he has been accused of having, he is inspiring regardless, and is a key figure in the film industry, and especially in the Australian film industry. His first film, Strictly Ballroom, about a ballroom dancer determined to establish an innovative style of dance in the traditional competitive industry, is perhaps a metaphor for Baz Luhrmann's own attempts to bring his filmmaking style of red curtain cinema into the mainstream.